Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer, and today I'm going to be deciding which denomination I would be if I were not Presbyterian. This is the most common question I get in Q&As. Which denomination would I be if I were not Presbyterian or Reformed or Calvinist? And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't really know. I've answered this question differently at different points in my life, so I'm going to be figuring this out with you guys. This is not a scripted video. So I have the 8 major alternative Christian traditions to Reformed laid out here in a bracket, and I'm going to be deciding between each of these each of these matchups between two denominations. So I excluded some. I excluded ones that are too similar to Presbyterian. I'm not including Dutch Reformed because that's basically theologically identical to Presbyterian. Same with Congregationalist. And I grouped all the major traditions together. I grouped all Anglicans together, all Baptists together. You get the idea. And I'm also not evaluating these by the liberal versions of any of them. I know that some Methodists are liberal, some Anglicans are liberal, even some Catholics are liberal, but they don't represent true Methodism, Anglicanism, or Catholicism. So those are all irrelevant. This is assuming that we have the traditional version of each of these denominations. Let's get started with our first bracket between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. I think this is pretty easy for me. I think I would rather be Roman Catholic. And by the way, I am not evaluating which of these denominations are better. I'm saying which one I would rather be because one of them is a lot more similar to Presbyterian. And I hope that if you're Eastern Orthodox, you can probably agree with me that Catholicism is more similar to Presbyterian than Eastern Orthodox is. So I think you can still probably agree that this is what makes most sense from my perspective, right? So there's a few reasons. Number one, Catholics and Protestants, with all their disagreements, have the same doctrine of God because we both believe in the filioque, which teaches that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And I think this is the most biblical view because there's a lot of passages like, Galatians 4:6, Romans 8:9, which clearly identify the Holy Spirit as the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of the Son. And yeah, I know that the Eastern Orthodox have their explanations for those passages. It's not like they can't read or anything, but I still think it's the most biblical explanation, and I think you can see this view a lot in church history. Athanasius held to it, Augustine definitely held to it, even most Orthodox people will admit that, and I think it's theologically important to say the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of Christ, because it shows that you can't have any spiritual experiences that are divorced from Christ. I think the filioque makes the most sense. I think it's the most biblical. That's the number one reason I'm not Eastern Orthodox. And, predestination is actually a Catholic belief. Most people don't know this. There's a lot more similarities between Catholicism and Calvinism than people realize. For example, the traditional Calvinism teaches that baptism saves and that we really receive the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. Most modern Calvinists are unaware of that. But Catholicism also traditionally teaches predestination, and most modern Catholics are unaware of that. Now, what a lot of Catholics will say is, no. Catholicism teaches single predestination, whereas Calvinism teaches double predestination, but I think this is a misunderstanding of what both of those terms mean. A lot of people think that double predestination means God actively sends some people to heaven and actively sends other people to hell, but that's not what it means. Double predestination just means God elects some people and not other people. Single predestination means God elects some people but does not elect anyone, and it's a mystery why some people are not saved. The only people who actually teach single predestination are Lutherans. So double predestination is a medieval Catholic scholastic teaching from, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and the Calvinists inherited predestination from the medieval Catholics. It wasn't until after the Reformation that the Jesuits were Catholics who went on sort of anti-Calvinist crusades, and because of them, most modern Catholics are very skeptical of Calvinist language surrounding predestination. The Jesuits accused the Thomist Catholics following Thomas Aquinas of being Calvinist. But no, infralapsarian Calvinists inherited their doctrine of predestination from Thomas Aquinas, and supralapsarian Calvinists inherited their doctrine of predestination from Duns Scotus. And that speaks to the broader agreement between Catholics and Calvinists on scholasticism. Both Catholics and Presbyterians are very intellectual Christian traditions, and both of them have founded some of the best universities in the world, done a lot of science and stuff, so that's why, in many ways, I see Catholicism as much more similar to what I believe. Reformed theology really just is Catholicism reformed by the Bible. It really is Reformed Catholicism. That's how all the early Calvinists refer to themselves. They didn't like being named after John Calvin. Calvinist was originally used as an insult. All right, so that's pretty clear. Next up, we have Baptist versus Methodist, and I would definitely say I'd rather be Methodist than Baptist. A lot of people are like, oh, what do you mean? Methodists are liberal. Like I said, I am not evaluating any of these by the liberal versions of them. There are liberal Baptists, but there are also liberal Methodists. There are conservative Baptists. There are conservative Methodists. I'm evaluating these based on the traditional historic versions of all of them. So why Methodist over Baptist? Well, Methodists have a much different approach than Presbyterians do, but the theology is actually quite similar. Methodists and Presbyterians have almost an identical view of the sacraments. They tend to have a spiritual presence view of communion like we do. They believe in infant baptism like we do. And there have been Calvinistic Methodists. You know, George Whitefield, along with John Wesley, is one of the founders of Methodism. He was Calvinist. And there are modern Calvinistic Methodists like Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. So you could be hold to Calvinist soteriology and be a Methodist. Methodism is just a more experiential revivalist version of Protestantism more broadly, Calvinism more specifically. So it's like on the high church, low church scale, Presbyterians and Methodists are kind of in the same place. We're not exactly high church, but we're not exactly low church either. We're kind of mid church. I know mid is like an insult in Gen Z slang, but you know what I mean. Both of them have this nice balance between high church and low church. I'd say the real difference between Methodists and Presbyterians is that Presbyterians are more thinkers and Methodists are more doers, and you need some of both. So because of that, Methodists, I will admit, are much nicer people than Presbyterians. The downside is Methodists tend to not care so much about Methodist theology. And that's why when a lot of Methodist churches, disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church, they just became non-denominational. They didn't join the Global Methodist Church even. They just gave up and stopped caring about being Methodist at all because there's a lot of theological apathy that exists in Methodist circles. It's really a trade-off. Everything in theology is a trade-off because it's impossible for humans to be perfect. But I would still choose Methodist over Baptist because Methodists have much more of a connection to the magisterial Reformation than Baptists. I know that Baptists aren't identical to Anabaptists, but there are a lot of similarities. Baptists generally push much more of a radical Reformation than a magisterial Reformation. The difference is that the magisterial Reformation is, the Protestant Reformation with Luther and Calvin and all those guys. They were trying to continue the Catholic Church but reform it with the scriptures while still holding on to a lot of tradition, while still being very sacramental, while still hanging on to, beauty, institutions, all those things. Whereas the Baptists were a lot more restorationist. They're a lot more radical. They're a lot more revolutionary, trying to rebuild the church from scratch and completely distance themselves from Catholicism. So if you're Baptist, I'm sure you can admit that Methodist is a lot more similar to Presbyterian. I know that they're Reformed Baptists, but the word Reformed Baptist is a very, very modern thing. You can look up on, Google Ngram when the term Reformed Baptist was used. It didn't come into common parlance until like the 1980s with the whole new Calvinism movement with, John Piper and John MacArthur, when a bunch of Baptists decided they wanted to be Reformed, but they only defined Reformed as really agreeing with predestination and not all the other beliefs of Reformed theology like the sacraments. So yes, Reformed Baptists might agree more with Presbyterians on predestination, but Methodists would agree more with Calvinists and Presbyterians on like everything else. So that's why I'd say Methodist over Baptist. Now we get to Anglican Lutheran. This is too tricky for me. I'm going to skip this for now and go to Oriental Orthodox versus Assyrian Church of the East. Now, both of these are non-Chalcedonian ancient churches that split off from the mainstream Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church pretty early on. The Assyrian Church of the East followed Nestorius and split off at the Council of Ephesus, whereas the Oriental Orthodox followed St. Dioscorus and split off after the Council of Chalcedon. So really, they believe opposite things. The Church of the East followed Nestorian theology, which radically separated the two natures of Christ, the human and divine natures, but modern ecumenical dialogue with them has revealed that they're not as Nestorian as people thought they were. A lot of modern evangelicals are way more Nestorian than the literal Nestorian church. And the Oriental Orthodox, they said that they were miaphysite, which means one nature. They believe that Jesus has one nature that's fully human and fully divine, rather than two natures, a fully human nature and a fully divine nature. Some people say it's just semantics. I think it's a bit more than semantics, but I still do think they were unfairly anathematized. So between the two, which is better? Do I think it's better to separate the natures of Christ too much, or do I think it's better to conflate the natures of Christ too much? This really goes back to the broader question of Alexandrian theology, which led to the Oriental Orthodox splitting off, and Antiochene theology from Antioch, which led to the Assyrian Church of the East splitting off. These were the two main schools in like the early post-Constantine imperial church. Those were the two main schools of theology. They were sort of like the yin and yang of the, I don't want to say early church, but the, post-Constantine, post-Nicaea early church. And the Alexandrian school, not only did they speak a lot more about the oneness of Christ, but they talked a lot more about the, spiritual cosmic dimensions of the Bible. Whereas the Antiochene school, not only did they focus on the two-ness of Christ, but they focused a lot more on the human, earthly aspects of the gospel. In general, I find myself sympathizing a lot more with Alexandrian theology and the Alexandrian fathers than the Antiochene fathers. For example, I like St. Athanasius and St. Cyril of Alexandria a lot more than people like John Chrysostom, even though they're all, great examples. So I am much more sympathetic to Alexandrian theology, so that's why I'd say I'd probably rather be Oriental Orthodox over Nestorian. And I think Miaphysitism is a much more trivial error than Nestorianism, because Nestorianism leads to a denial that God died for us, and the whole gospel is that God died for us. And I know that it's very, very nuanced. I know that this is an oversimplification. I know that the literal Nestorians were somewhat strawmanned at Ephesus and were not quite as Nestorian as people thought they were. And Nestorius eventually even admitted to using the term Mother of God. But even so, there still is a reason why I prefer Oriental Orthodox over Assyrian Church of the East. Now is the hard part, but choosing between Anglican and Lutheran. So the reason this is hard is because Anglicans are like such a broad spectrum. So there's some Anglicans that I would say are closer to Reformed than Lutherans are. Some Anglicans are like Reformed Anglican, where they're literally just Calvinists with bishops. But other Anglicans are Anglo-Catholic, where they're literally just Catholics, but more likely to be gay. Not all Anglo-Catholics are liberal, of course, but I feel like if you're Anglo-Catholic, why not just be Catholic? Because, I don't know. I'm sure they have their reasons. I just offended a lot of people. I don't know. I've been offending Catholics too much lately, so now it's the Anglicans' turn to be offended, okay? You have to wait your turn for me to say something offensive about you. So Anglicanism is just such a broad range, and I respect how Lutherans are a lot more consistent in their thinking. But at the same time, Anglicanism has had so much more of an impact on Presbyterian theology. There's been so much more cross-pollination. And I think Anglicanism has had a much broader influence on the world than Lutheranism. There was a massive Anglican empire. The Church of England, the British Empire, did so much massive good for the world. And there was never really a super mighty Lutheran empire. And because I'm a mainline Protestant, because I'm very Kuiperian, I will absolutely evaluate denominations based on how much objective impact they have on the world, because I believe in kingdom theology. I think it's the church's job to have a transformative impact on the world. So between these two, it's really close, but I think I would put Anglican over Lutheran. I still have the utmost respect for Lutheran theology. Understanding Lutheran theology helped me understand Reformed theology because those two traditions sort of developed parallel to each other. But at the end of the day, I might say Anglican over Lutheran. So now it is between Roman Catholic and Methodist. So here's the thing. When it comes to Roman Catholicism, there are things that are super duper amazing about it and things that are really bad about it, from my perspective. Whereas Methodism, it's sort of like, okay. There's nothing great about Methodism, nothing terrible about Methodism. It's just sort of like, a B. Whereas Roman Catholicism, some things are an A+, and some things are like an F. So the great things about Roman Catholicism, First of all, just how large it is, how massively impactful it's been. The Roman Catholic Church objectively does more good in the world these days in terms of, helping the poor, fighting against abortion, helping widows and orphans, does more for that on a large scale than any other organization due to their massive size and biblical values. Of course, some of their social teachings I think are a bit unbiblical, such as them permitting, marriage to unbelievers. But for the most part, all these Christian denominations agree on what good social teaching is. Calvinist social teaching is very similar to Catholic social teaching. Catholics have made so many developments in music, like classical music and Baroque music. Now, of course, Protestants have had made equally as many developments. Bach and Handel were Protestant, were Lutheran. Claude Gudemel, Jan Pieterszoon Sweelinck were Calvinist. So many great hymns come from Anglicans and Methodists. So Protestants and Catholics both have had a massive influence on music. But, my favorite style of music overall is the Italian Baroque, which is mostly Roman Catholic. I love Torelli and Corelli and Albinoni. So I cannot underestimate the impact Roman Catholicism has had. At the same time, I don't believe the Roman Church has completely abandoned the gospel, but there are so many places in the world, so many Roman Catholic environments where the gospel is just never taught, where people go through the motions and treat the faith like a checklist, and they never really hear the gospel, especially in Catholic majority countries. I feel like in America, Catholicism is at its best because it has had to compete with Protestantism. But if you go to like Latin America or Poland or the Philippines, it's a lot about, praying to statues. I'm sorry. And there's a lot of syncretism with some pagan beliefs. And I've had people like Trent Horn, I've talked to Trent Horn, he's a really awesome guy, admit to me that there are many pockets of the world in which Catholicism does indeed mix with some pagan beliefs, and that is a big problem. And the idea that, these things like purgatory and the idea that you can commit mortal sins and fall away from a state of grace, these ideas are very dangerous to one's faith. And the Reformation happened for a reason. Even though I don't believe Catholics are heretics, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of unbiblical things that have gradually built up in the Roman Church like a snowball rolling down a dirty hill. That's how I see Roman Catholicism. Like, a lot of Calvinists will say they've abandoned the gospel. I don't think they have. I think the core of Catholicism is that pure snowball of true Christianity, but it's rolled down a muddy hill for 2,000 years. It's accumulated a lot of unbiblical and sometimes quasi-pagan practices. So between the two, what would I say? It's very, very tough, but I think I might say Methodist, because I just have so much respect for the Methodists that I know and have interacted with. Nobody follows Jesus like a born-again Methodist. And Jesus said, by their fruit you will know them. He didn't say, by their valid apostolic succession you will know them. Methodists are the most charitable of all Christians when it comes to online discussions, when it comes to ecumenical dialogue. The best conversations I've had have been with Methodists when they even bother to talk about theology, which is almost never. So I greatly respect Roman Catholicism, but I think I would still rather be Methodist between the two. Now we get to Anglican and Oriental Orthodox, and I think this is pretty obvious I'd be Anglican, because, as much as I, respect Oriental Orthodoxy, just like Methodists, Oriental Orthodox are super humble and loving online and in person. Of all the interactions I've had with them, I don't think I've ever had a negative interaction with a devout Oriental Orthodox believer. I cannot say the same about the Eastern Orthodox. Just kidding. I love you guys, but you gotta control your online catechumens, seriously. So it's not that. Both Anglicans and Oriental Orthodox are very, very nice groups of people, but I agree with Anglicans on the vast majority of theological issues, and I can't say the same with Oriental Orthodox. A lot of Anglicans believe in predestination. All Anglicans follow the Council of Chalcedon, which Oriental Orthodox do not. So this is a pretty clear win for Anglicans. And now, it is down to Anglicans versus Methodists. Now, this is tough. I will admit that this is tough, but at the end of the day, I do need to admit that Anglicans are more classical Protestant than Methodists. There's really two types of Methodists. Some Methodists are just Anglicans without, a strict Episcopal system. Some Methodists are just revivalist Anglicans. other Methodists are just Baptists who can read. So Methodism is not really unified in terms of its theological convictions, but then again, neither is Anglicanism. Anglicans don't even know what Anglicanism is. Maybe I should have stuck with Lutheranism, but no. I think as a Presbyterian, as someone who appreciates the Reformation, I think at the end of the day, I would find a better home in another denomination that also comes from the Reformation, just like Presbyterianism. So I think at the end of the day, I would have to say that Anglicanism is the winner. So if I was not Presbyterian, if I were not Presbyterian, I'll give them a star because, you know, they're a star. If I were not Presbyterian, I think I would be Anglican. So tell me if you guys disagree. Tell me if you guys are Presbyterian and you would have like a different bracket or something. Feel free to, you know, copy paste my bracket and use it for your own things. You know, there's no copyright on my little denomination seals, by the way. And that's another thing. A lot of other servers and YouTube channels have been using my little denomination seals like these, and that is totally cool. You can do whatever you want with them. I'm not going to copyright the church. I'm not going to copyright theology, okay? This all belongs to the Lord. Whatever I do, no matter how derpy and silly it is. So guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you guys later.